A reflection on Palm Sunday. Often in the Gospels we find Jesus spending significant time with those on the fringe and margins of society and respectability. Even as his execution, a gruesome death, draws near, Jesus, we are told in Mark and Matthew's Gospel, is found at the home of a marginalized person, Simon the leper. On the Saturday before Palm Sunday, before Jesus makes a massive political statement, he is in the shelter and home of a social outcast, Simon the leper, much like he was in the shelter and comfort of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus' home. The significance of this is perhaps lost to us in modern times, until we think of a class of people we today would frown upon, never socialize with, or worse still, be utterly repulsed by. Jesus spent time in such a person's home on the eve of a huge political statement, religious statement he was about to make. In the shelter and seclusion of Simon the leper's home, Jesus would have been fed, cared for, held, encouraged, and strengthened, prayed with and prayed for. Can you imagine how Simon's family, and perhaps how his children in particular, must have felt having Jesus as their guest, locked down with him? Today, Palm Sunday, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a small colt that he had deliberately chosen to make a massive political and religious statement about his love and lifestyle, about what he thought about current power, sovereignty, and leadership in first century Palestine. Symbols of power and status in his day were horses and chariots, if you were in the military or wealthy enough to be carted or carried about. But Jesus, as he is painted in the Gospels, is neither. Perhaps saying to us, seriously now, I have always come to you differently, counterculturally. Don't you get it? Can you open your heart to the way I am coming to you now? If you want to recognize and spot me in your life and in the world, you've got to learn to look at and envisage love, God, and life differently. And it is almost always against what popular culture says life, love, success, achievement, God, and blessing is all about. Let us return to the imagery of Palm Sunday. People blanketed the street with their cloaks. The symbolism here is magnificent. If you were a poor person, your cloak was also your shelter, your refuge and home. If you were a wealthy person, and here I think of the story of Joseph and this beautiful coat that his dad had made him. If you were a wealthy person, it was a symbol of privilege and status, a gift of love from someone who cared for you enormously. And so, by blanketing the streets with their cloaks, they were in effect saying, whether rich or poor, Jesus, you are my shelter, my security, my refuge. These are what I lay before you. My privilege, my status, my love, Jesus, is what I lay before you. I'm willing to become vulnerable for you, Jesus. I'm willing to divest myself for you, Jesus. Here I am, hiding behind nothing for you, Jesus. Here I am, publicly aligning myself with you, Jesus. You fill my heart with great energy and joy, Jesus. That is why I am here. You give me the spiritual courage to make a stand, even though I might lose much by doing so. In your own quiet time, when you reflect upon this story, the ride into Jerusalem, Why don't you formulate some of your own imaginative prayers? Start by saying, "Here I am, Jesus." In Roman circles, palms were a sign of victory and triumph. In Jewish circles, palms were a traditional sign of celebration and joy. And so that is what they were doing on that first Palm Sunday, celebrating Jesus, making a courageous political stand with him and for him, saying, in effect, this is the kind of countercultural leadership, power, kingship we embrace, that flies in the face of Rome, the narrative of love we are willing to die for. We must identify our own modern forms of imperialism, modern ways in which the church has been captured by things like glamour, status, prestige, capitalism, the worship of power and wealth. Have we lost the sense of a sanctuary in exchange for a stage, for camera, lights, loud music, and action devoid of contemplation, solitude, and prayer? By standing with Jesus, that first century audience were making themselves hugely vulnerable. They were saying, "Jesus, you are my security." The colt, the foal of a donkey, is also significant, and it alludes to a passage from Zechariah which Jesus might have known personally. The king enters the city on just such an animal. But in the main, that is not what most people want. We don't want a God to be defined like that in such humble, unassuming terms. And of course, within less than a week, people would turn on Jesus and do what humanity always does to a love that is far too generous, a love that is far too genuine, far too embracing, forgiving, compassionate, merciful, just, and authentic, a love that is far too loving and scandalously, outrageously real. We destroy it, or we conspire to do so. And all of this will come to a head in this week we call Holy.